Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. We make hundreds, sometimes thousands of decisions a day. What to wear, what to eat, what route to take to work, and what to put on our to-do list. But these are tactical decisions. They get us from point A to point B. But what about the big strategic decisions, the big ones that just might impact our lives and the lives of others now and for many years to come? The decisions about who we marry, where we want to live, what career we want to pursue. These are often irrevocable or at least profound decisions that have long-term consequences. How do we make these decisions? And for that matter, how do leaders, CEOs, generals, and even presidents make decisions? Is there a right or wrong way? Do algorithms and technology make it easier or harder? The fact is, oftentimes, by the time all the facts are in, the time for optimum or imaginative action may have long since disappeared. The disconnect, then, between external events and our ability to process them somehow lies embedded in the decision-making process. From George Bush saying he's the decider, to battlefield commanders, from the halls of business schools to the basement of the Pentagon, from leaders that operate only on instinct devoid of facts, to those that suffer from analysis paralysis. Our lives are shaped by decisions we and others make. But could we do better? We're going to talk about that today with my guest, Steven Johnson. Steven Johnson is the best-selling author of 11 books, including Wonderland, How We Got to Now, Where Good Ideas Come From, and The Invention of Air. It is my pleasure to welcome Steven Johnson back to this program to talk about his newest work, Farsighted, How We Make the Decisions That Matter the Most. Steven, thanks so much for joining us.
Jeff, it's so great to be back. That was a beautiful introduction. I'd like to steal that and actually put it into the paperback version of the book.
It's all yours.
Thank you.
Thank you. When you set out to do this, and it's something I wondered in reading it, is this a psychological conversation or is this a scientific conversation, or both, and what percentage?
Yeah, well, and actually I would complicate that. I would say both, and also add that it's also an artistic, kind of a literary conversation as well, because one of the arguments that the book makes at the end is that novels are actually reading kind of classic novels is a really wonderful way to kind of train the mind to make better decisions if we're talking about those big life-changing decisions, because literary narrative gives us these in-depth kind of slow-motion portrayals of people making complex decisions, and so in a sense give us a simulation or practice at making these choices. So it's a mix. It's really, like a lot of the books that I write, it's cross-disciplinary. It's a mix of science, psychology, of course, which is a kind of science, I suppose, and brain science, behavioral economics, but also literary creation.
It's interesting when you talk about the literary part of it. The other question it raises within the decision-making construct is the degree to which decision-making is so much a part of creativity and how that works.
Yeah, this is one of the things I didn't really realize was going to happen until I got in the middle of writing the book. So, a lot of my work over the years, much of which we've discussed on this show, has been about innovation and kind of technological creativity, right? Coming up with new technologies that change the world in all these interesting and unpredictable ways. A lot of my work has looked at the history of innovation, and so, and through that research, I've learned a lot of things about how people can become more creative and more inventive and think of new solutions to problems I might not have thought of otherwise. And a lot of those techniques actually overlap with the kinds of techniques people need to use in making complex decisions, because in a sense, what you're trying to do one of the key things you're trying to do when you're making one of these life-altering decisions is not trust your initial assessment of the situation, right? Because however smart you are, if you're at one of these crossroads where you're contemplating a choice that might reverberate for 10 years or longer, there's no doubt you're missing something. There's some variable, there's probably multiple things about the decision, about its consequences, about maybe alternate options that you might have that you haven't even thought of yet. There's something about it, and probably many things that haven't occurred to you yet. And so the part of the process that you have to go through in making a complex decision is forcing yourself to see the world from new perspectives, to see the problem that you're contemplating from new perspectives. And that's very similar to the process of creativity and innovation.
Which leads to the question of, because there's so many things that we don't see in the decision-making process, there are so many kind of known unknowns, as it were, that one wonders if you would turn out the same, if events would turn out the same if you just flip the proverbial coin.
Yeah, well, that is, I believe, from what I have looked at and the folks that I've talked to and the studies I've looked at, I think there is a compelling argument that we do have strategies now that empirically, on average, lead to better outcomes. So let me give you one example, right? There's a great on the kind of business decision-making side, there's a kind of management professor, scholar now, I believe he's now retired, named Paul Nutt. And he's kind of like the Darwin of business decisions, right? He's built this whole theory, and he studied, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands probably of decisions that executives made in businesses, and studied the approach that they took and studied the outcomes of the decision. And one of the things that he found from this research is that there is a serious penalty in terms of the long-term success of a decision if you only contemplate one option. So he calls them whether or not decisions, right? It's just you're like, should we do this or not? And it turns out those decisions end up being failures more than 50% of the time. Like 25% of them are judged as successful decisions. And the easiest way to increase your success rate, basically, in these decisions is to have a phase in the decision-making process where you try to uncover other options. So you turn it from a whether or not decision to a which one decision, right? And if you go through a phase where you actively try and uncover, a third option or fourth option, your success rate goes up dramatically. So, and there are a lot of studies in the book that kind of go through kind of similar research. So that, to me, the whole body of that research suggests that, yes, you can never be 100% confident with these decisions, and maybe it would have turned out better if you just flipped a coin in this one particular choice, but the odds are in your favor if you use some of these strategies. There's enough research behind them, I think, to really believe in this, in the kinds of approaches that I talk about in the book.
It's an interesting idea because there's a subset of that where people have argued that if you have an intractable problem, if you can't solve a problem, if you can't get to a decision, that sometimes the solution is to turn that into a bigger problem, which then might lead to a decision.
Yeah, well, you end up, you sometimes end up with these kind of loops or escalating kind of problems where you look at the problem so rigorously that you end up discovering an even kind of like bigger path. And I think there is a danger. Look, I don't want to. Part of what I'm arguing in the book is to take time with these decisions. Think of it as a process. Go through different phases. Go through a mapping phase. Go through a predicting phase, which we can talk about in more detail. But you also don't want to get. You don't want to get stuck, right? You don't want to get into a situation where you're just kind of endlessly analyzing the problem. There's a great, Jeff Bezos apparently has this great rule of thumb that he tells people about at Amazon for making decisions, which is what he calls the 70% rule, which is, wait until you get to 70% certainty about a choice, and then make it. Don't wait until you have 100% certainty, because you will never get to 100% certainty, and thus you will never choose anything. So you want to get to a certain threshold of certainty, but you don't want to get all the way there, or else you'll get stuck.
The other part of it is the degree to which our life experience and what we bring to trying to make a decision and how different experiences lead to different decisions, sometimes even with the same facts.
Yeah, and look, that is one of the reasons why, and this is a key theme of the book, is why having different life experiences shape the decision you're contemplating, right? Having a diverse group of people help you make the choice. There is a really rich body of kind of social science and group psychology that it sometimes goes under the rubric of diversity trumps ability. That a smart group of like-minded people will make worse decisions than a less smart group of diverse people, because there's something about the different life experiences, as you say, that diversity brings to the table, and that diversity can be in the form of ethnic diversity or gender diversity, but also intellectual diversity, professional diversity, different ways of seeing the world, different perspectives, different fields of expertise. And when you get an interesting, eclectic group of people, it's a little bit like the team of rivals idea to some extent from Lincoln. When you get those different perspectives looking at the problem, they're going to uncover variables or potential consequences that you wouldn't have been able to see given your own background, given your own experiences. And so it's this is a political point as well, right? When we see, I don't want to, name names here, name administrations here, but when we see, a political body that is made up of people who all come from the same background or look the same or are all men, there's a natural tendency and an appropriate tendency to say, oh, well, that's not a good thing. We want to have more diversity so that we can have, equal representation, or we can have role models for people that they can succeed in society. But it's also true, in addition to those things being true, it's also true that like-minded group, that homogeneous group, is going to be less farsighted, less intelligent in the decisions it makes on average than a more eclectic, more diverse group.
Is there a danger, and you spend a lot of time in Farsighted talking about how the military makes decisions, how generals make decisions, of using previous examples, and sometimes that's positive and sometimes it's negative. It's the classic story of fighting the current war based on the lessons of the last one, and that's not always the best example.
Yeah, that's a really important question that I wrestled with a lot in just writing this book, right? So this is a book that it has a lot of historical stories. I think it's fun to read. I think I think people will find some of the science interesting and the storytelling interesting. But it's also supposed to be helpful, right? It's supposed to give people, advice on how to make decisions in their own lives. And just by the nature of writing a book and the nature of people's complex life choices, I don't know the people who are reading this book, right? I don't know their choices. I don't know who they are, right? I don't know the details. And so I tried to really wrestle with that. And I talk about that in the book in some detail, which is, how can something like this be useful if every major life decision is unique? It's a fingerprint, it's a snowflake, it's its own unique constellation of things. What's the use of overarching kind of principles or methods when every decision like this is so unique? And where I ultimately came out, and I almost didn't write the book in the middle of the research because I was kind of stuck on this problem. But what I eventually realized is that all of the strategies that science has uncovered and that I write about in the book are in one way or another ways of seeing, ways of perceiving the problem, tricks to get your brain to understand it with more nuance or from different angles, tricks to get your brain better at predicting or overcoming some of the biases that human beings have, confirmation bias and so on, overconfidence, groupthink, all these things that plague us. And those are just generally applicable techniques. Your decision that you're facing in your life is yours. It's unique. It's never happened before. But these techniques, I do believe, will help you understand that unique constellation, to see it more clearly, whatever the particular variables happen to be.
Right. The other danger, I suppose, you talk about confirmation bias and some of those things that enter into it. The other thing is kind of the comfort factor. If we've made decisions once or twice or hundreds of times and they've given us certain results that we're happy with, we tend to then use that construct for other life decisions, and that's not always the best either.
Yeah, although look, I think if people have developed a technique that they use and that they've used in the past that has worked well for them in making decisions, I don't want to take away from that. The problem that I think most people have is that they don't have a technique, or they have a very simple technique. I mean, the book starts with this kind of funny story about Darwin. In the 1830s, in the middle of discovering natural selection, in his scientific notebooks from this period, he has this one page where he jots down notes on another important idea, which is whether he should get married or not. And he basically makes a pros and cons list for getting married, which is very funny, and it's because it's a little dated in some of his values. But I started that at the beginning of the book because the pros and cons list is the one technique that most of us have probably learned to make a complex decision in our lives. And so by definition, it's like a technique that's like 200 years old. It hasn't really changed. And it's useful, but there are actually a lot more developed techniques that we can use for making decisions like that. And so if other folks have a set of strategies that they've used in the past that have really worked, then I think actually that is some empirical evidence from your own life that, maybe you have figured out a technique for making a complex decision. The problem is most people don't have a technique. Most people just kind of go with their gut. They talk a little bit informally with their partner or their friend about it, and then they decide. And they don't go through some of the stages that I talk about in the book. They don't have, an approach to the decision. And that's what I think is missing for most people. It's not sufficient, I think, to go with your gut in decisions of this magnitude.
Mm-hmm. How important is collecting data or information in the process? What have you found?
There's an initial phase that is very important, which is what you kind of alluded to before, which is this mapping phase. And in that phase, you are really trying to understand all the different variables that may, kind of come into play in the choice you're confronting, as well as trying to understand if there are other options, which we talked about before, trying to turn it from a whether or not decision into a which one decision. And in that stage, it's sometimes called the divergence stage, because you're not trying to decide yet. You're not trying to narrow your options. You're not trying to figure out what the key variables are. You're just trying to discover as many possible things as possible. And then the second and third phases are about kind of narrowing and trying to figure out what you really want to do. But to put your brain in a state for a while of like, I'm not going to make this choice for another 3 weeks. This week and next week or this month, I'm going to just be looking for as many different angles at this as I can, talking to as many different people, bringing in an interesting eclectic mix of people to help me make this choice, to expose new variables that I might not have seen at first glance.
When you do that, talk a little bit about what you found is the relationship between personal decisions and business decisions or military decisions. Is the process the same or is it different?
I think it's. I think it is. There's more similarity than one would think. There's obviously, if you think about Darwin deciding whether to get married, there are, emotional components to that decision. There are, romantic, sexual components to that decision that probably shouldn't be involved in most business decisions or military decisions. But actually, I think there's a lot to learn from those kinds of choices. So there's this thread running through the book about the the Bin Laden raid during the Obama administration, because the decision process that the administration went through in first deciding whether or not Bin Laden was in the compound in Pakistan, and then the decision of what to do about it once they reached a certain level of confidence that it was Bin Laden in this compound. That whole process was really run very actively as a process, and they used consciously a lot of the strategies that I talk about in the book. They had a clear divergence phase where they tried to come up with, there's a kind of fascinating series of exercises they did where Leon Panetta kind of challenged everybody and made them come up with alternate interpretations for who this guy, this suspicious guy they thought was Bin Laden, might be. Like, a lot of people were starting to be convinced that it was Bin Laden, and he was like, no, I want you guys to come up with stories of who this person could be, and in all these stories, he's not Bin Laden. And going through that exercise of trying to imagine kind of counterfactual scenarios, or trying to imagine, kind of contrarian scenarios, was a really important part of the process. In the end, they ended up feeling confident that they'd made the right choice. But because they had challenged their assumptions, because they had spent time probing kind of the levels of uncertainty with this really key choice, they ended up making a much more informed decision in the end.
One of the things that becomes clear in all of this is the decision-making, whatever the process is, whatever works for the individual or within an organization, that it takes a significant amount of work. And oftentimes when we hear people talking about they just make decisions from instinct or their gut or what have you, it becomes clear that that's really a kind of a lazy way out.
Yeah, it's easier, and I actually think I think there is a role for instinct here, but it's kind of informed instinct is the way I would think about it. So in the book, I have there are three phases, right? We've talked about two of them, really: mapping, predicting, and then deciding, right? So you map all the variables, then you predict the outcomes from the various different options that you see. And there are a couple of different exercises there, which we can talk about potentially. And then you have to decide. And in the decision stage, there are some techniques that I talk about how to kind of weigh all the different variables and actually make a decision. Some of them are almost kind of updated versions of the pros and cons list that do a little bit better job of weighting your values that are important to you. But honestly, at that stage, if you've gone through the slower exercise of coming up with variables, getting diverse perspectives on the problem, predicting different outcomes, if you've gone through that exercise, what your gut is telling you at that point, I think you might very well be well served by listening to your gut at that point, because you have built up this wider perspective on the problem by going through the initial exercises. But the danger is just going with your gut right at the top and not going through the process of giving your sense of intuition more data to process.
Right. I mean, it does require, or it should require, going through the process. It's a little bit like, if you talk to business executives, it's a little bit like writing business plans. Oftentimes, the plan doesn't really reflect what evolves for the business, but if you hadn't gone through that exercise, you wouldn't have the knowledge, the information, the instinct to go forward.
It's exactly right. And in fact, I think one of the arguments that I make in Farsighted is, in a sense, the real way to do it is to write multiple business plans, right? I mean, this is this whole field of scenario planning, which is a lot of the practitioners of are in the Bay Area. And one of the techniques that people use in scenario planning, which is a business technique, but I think you can actually apply it in your own life, is you imagine multiple scenarios for each option you're weighing, right? Don't just write the plan based on, this is how we think it's going to work, it's going to be great. Also write a plan where you choose that option and things go really, really badly, and kind of map out that negative scenario and imagine what that's like, and force yourself to contemplate that negative scenario and to tell that story. It's a really narrative kind of arc. And the other thing that I love, this is kind of a cool trick. Peter Schwartz talks about this, who's a Bay Area a guy. In scenario planning, sometimes the strategy is you tell three scenarios. One where things get better, one where things get worse, and one where things get weird.
Right.
and I love that. It's such a great idea because because the future is so hard to predict with these complicated decisions, whether it's a business decision or, a personal decision. And just forcing your mind to come up with a future set of events that are weird, it unlocks some, kind of perspective on the problem that you wouldn't necessarily have come up with in that initial gut assessment of the situation.
And what are you finding, finally, about how this is being taught today, whether it's in business schools, whether it's what psychiatrists and psychologists are telling their patients? How is this being taught and dealt with today?
Well, I think the biggest problem, actually, is that it's not being taught. Business school is certainly a place where decision-making is taught. Yes, if you are trained as some kind of psychologist, you will have some expertise in helping people make decisions. But I don't understand why this isn't a required course in every high school in this country for a couple of reasons. Because, first off, it is, no matter what you do in your life, whatever you end up doing, whatever your profession is, making better long-term decisions is going to be a skill that will be invaluable, right? As close to the definition of kind of wisdom as we have, as they make wise long-term decisions. And the other thing about it is that it's, as I hope the book shows, it's a wonderfully multidisciplinary topic, right? You would take that course on decision-making and you would learn about neuroscience, and you would learn about behavioral economics, and you would learn about probability, and you would learn about literature and narrative, and evolutionary history and the brain, and fMRI imaging of the brain, and all these different fields, and that itself would give you more perspectives because of the multidisciplinary nature of it. So I think I hope to do a little bit more work on this going forward. It's one of my pet projects now is thinking about what a high school core required course in decision making would really look like, because it seems like that would be a great addition to any educational experience.
Stephen Johnson, his new book is Farsighted: How We Make the Decisions That Matter the Most. It's just out from Riverhead Books. Stephen, always a pleasure. I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Yeah, it's great to be back.
Thank you.